Outa-space. Because artists lack the time, resources, and places to make creative work. Outa-space. Because the street, the squares, and all the common places we mix in are where we need to decide our future. Outa-space. Because we need to take our minds above the clouds to look down on our planet, to dream, to wonder, but also to see everything in the context of everything else. Hi, I am RobbieBot, your in-flight community communication device. We hope you have a pleasant experience with us today. You can leave an optional tip in the links below. Art must be free, but the rent is not, so all support is welcome. Series 5, Far Right, Too Far, Episode 3, Mapping out the character and evolution of today's European far right.
So, hello. Today I'm joined by Vlad Bortun. Hi, Vlad. How you doing?
Hi, Rob. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. So, Vlad, who I think you are, okay? I've known you for maybe 10, 15 years, 10 at least. Let's say 15.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. We met in the UK, but we spent a lot of time fairly recently together. I think 3 or 4 years in you moved to Catalonia, and we're good friends. We like football together, and we are activists together. We've been involved in the far left on a whole load of issues in Spain and in England before that. So that's how I know you on a personal level. On a political level and political level, and then who I think you are in terms of what you do. You're a political scientist, an academic, and you've written a book and various stuff like that. Can you give us a bit more flavor of who you actually are and where you work, what you do?
Yes, I confirm everything you said. There was no lie in there. And I'm a political scientist. I like to describe myself as a critical political scientist because maybe our discussion will lead us to that point. But I have big reservations towards the field of political science, mainstream political science today. And that's reflected also in how it's dealing with this topic of the far right that we'll be talking about today. I've written a book recently based on my PhD about the radical left, the transnational cooperation of the radical left during the Eurozone crisis. And the conclusions are not very good about their cooperation. And at the moment, I'm working on British politics, particularly the nexus between class and political elites, and how class, which is usually a very privileged class background, shapes the outlook and behavior of British political elites. But for the coming years, my agenda, my research agenda will focus on what we'll be talking about today, which is the rise of so-called populist slash far-right parties in Europe.
Okay, good. I think it's important actually just to recognize at this stage that our connection is through activism. And when you say you're critical, I think particularly in Britain, less so in countries like Spain, but academics are seen as a bit of like over there in their own little bubble, and sometimes they go on demonstrations if they're the cool lecturer, I suppose. But actually, in general, in British left circles, the academics are seen as a little bit alien. And so when you say, is that what you mean when you say critical? Because I know that you're a person who does stuff. You're not just in your theoretical bubble. I know you like to go there too, and we've had many a long night talking things out. Is that what you mean when you say you're critical of that world?
Yeah, I think there's a double meaning to that. One, more specifically related to political science, which the mainstream of this field is, I find it very status quo legitimizing and enhancing. It's very much a mechanism of production and reproduction of the hegemonic ideology of liberal, neoliberal, democratic consensus. And I think the way this field of political science has dealt with the topic of the populist slash far right is a reflection of that, and we'll go into that. But also, yeah, more broadly, I feel academia is maybe uh, too much attached to the dominant discourses in society, and there's not enough space, at least in the mainstream of academia, there's not enough space for critical approaches and perspectives to society, to politics. But I feel that this is starting to change because the material conditions of academics, even in the UK, or maybe especially in the UK today, are changing the way, especially younger academics, think and act politically. The precarity, the job insecurity, the relatively poor pay conditions, the constant pressure to compete for grants and positions and publications leads, on the one hand, to a certain alienation that Marx talked about now, and I think maybe there should be a Marxist analysis of alienation in academia, but also leads to a certain political radicalization, and you could see that in the recent strikes that we've had here in the UK, and not very successful for several reasons, but it shows a certain level of militancy and radicalization among the younger, newer generations of academics that maybe previous periods didn't witness. So
Okay, yeah, I think that
I
gives
think
a good
it's a
flavour for the
broader trend.
listeners that you're not abstract. Although I don't think there's, because I think about art all the time. Sometimes you need to go to the abstract to find the reality. But I think your answer there shows where you're from. Just also to clarify, we've talked about England, UK, and we've talked about Spain, but actually you're from Romania, yeah?
Yes.
Okay, so I just think it's nice for the listener to understand. They can obviously tell in your accent,
Yeah.
you're from somewhere, and I think it's just nice to clarify. Okay, so this series, as people know who are listening in, this podcast is about the arts and class struggle, and the mixture of the two, and a number of other questions that we tackle with. And this series 5, is called Far Right Too Far. Okay, for me, the reason for doing that was because I am acutely aware that the far right is growing. I think a lot of people would agree with that. But I also am aware that people are not really analysing it in depth enough. And particularly those of us from the left aren't really understanding it. And so, although the artistic question always comes in, I want to bend the stick in this discussion with you. We'll talk about less today about arts and those things, but it'll always come in because that's what I'll bring to the table. But what I really want to do is with yourself today, and maybe in some other shows, is to really start getting down to some of the nitty gritty details about how or why the far right is growing today, and how that is, which parts are important about that, which parts are not so important, and we can compare and contrast different countries because this podcast is international. So my opening question for you is very broad, just to get us going. Could you paint a picture of, maybe in Europe to start with, of what is the current state of play with the growth of the far right? That we can say they're no longer little tiny little nutty groups in the corner, but we can see that they're starting to get some traction in certain countries and starting to become in government in certain countries. So can you give us like a broad sweep of the most important recent developments and where the far right sits at the moment?
Yeah, that's I think one of the most urgent questions of our political age, to map and understand the far right. And just from the beginning, to clarify, and I think you agree, when we talk about the far right, we include here the so-called populist right as well, which I think should be called by its real name, which is the far right. And I think maybe later in the discussion we'll focus a bit on this terminological question. But for years, you had the far right seen as particularly strong in Central Eastern Europe. Now, the former Stalinist regimes that turned to capitalism and liberal democracy more than 30 years ago, the delegitimization of the left there, and coupled with the deterioration of material conditions, obviously created a fertile ground for nationalists and far-right political forces. Even when they wouldn't get into government, they would shape the public agenda, they would shape the public debate. The famous case is Hungary, where the ruling party Fidesz and its leader Orban started as a moderate center-right liberal party, and when it realized that it was being outflanked on the right by Jobbik, the far-right nationalist anti-Semitic party, which even had a kind of paramilitary wing, Fidesz started to adopt some of its rhetoric. And in recent years, it's become arguably more right-wing than Jobbik. So now Jobbik is seen by many as more moderate than Orban's party, which is still in power in Hungary. Similar process.
I'm not going to allow you to even answer the whole question I posed, because you've just brought something up there. I think we can step into the question with that. You talked about Eastern Europe. You talked about the growth of the far right there and the collapse of Stalinism, the former in Russia and these places. And I think that's quite an interesting thing, because what took over in those countries was this idea that capitalism was going to be the savior of what the horrible characterization of Stalinism was. It wasn't socialism, it had become this monster. Therefore, and it collapsed, and we could discuss that in another program. And this laid the foundation for capitalism to be restored in its fullest amount. And the kind of capitalism that came in was a type of gangster capitalism quite quickly, and elements of the old bureaucracy took over and became the new capitalist class and this kind of thing. And I'm quite interested, because when we're going to map out now, slowly but surely, for the listeners, a bit of a history of where we got to today. Because when we talk about the rise of the far right, we need to start at some point. There's never one beginning point. There's often multiple points of beginning, but this is one point. That 30 years ago we have the development, we had this collapse of Stalinism, and we have gangster capitalism, let's call it that, because that's what it was, coming in, and then a competition. Are you kind of saying between who could be the most right wing, or could you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, because, by the way, gangster capitalism might be a pleonasm, I would argue that this kind of unbridled, unchained capitalism that spread in Eastern Europe after 1990 is the most pure form of capitalism. It's the most authentic form of capitalism, where capitalism has some elements of welfare state and workers' rights and policies aimed at reducing inequality. It's in spite of capitalism. It's because of, as you know very well, because of class struggle, because of pressure from below. Whereas in Eastern Europe, the collapse of those Stalinist regimes meant a collapse of the left, a collapse of consciousness, a collapse of the labor movement, of labor organizations, which were set up on a very precarious basis. And that meant that the restoration of capitalism was very brutal, was very rapid. Now, the shock therapy, although there were differences, of course, in Romania it was a bit delayed compared to other countries. In Poland and Russia it was much quicker and much more brutal, which meant that people who would be disillusioned after a few years of this, they would get disillusioned with the new order. There would be no left there, no left organized political left to capture the disillusionment. So they would turn towards the nationalist and populist far right that was emerging in these countries. And this is where the mainstream right, the so-called center right, in order to retain its grip on power, would try to outflank this insurgent right wing and adopt some of its nationalist rhetoric.
Okay, so we could say that in, let's say, in broad terms, Eastern Europe and Russia, there are right wing, far right wing regimes running countries, no?
Yeah.
And so Poland, Putin, Russia, these kind of places. How would you characterize those regimes?
I would say Poland now, after the last elections, seems to be going back towards the center, a kind of neoliberal center. It it's been met with a lot of cheers and congratulations by the establishments in the rest of Europe and by the European Union. So you have um, what's his name? The Donald Tusk. Now he's the new prime minister of Poland. But in Hungary, in Serbia, and of course in Russia, you would have what I would call far right authoritarian neoliberal regimes. So this is, I think, already opens up the avenue for us to make a key point in this discussion, that this far right is not fundamentally different from the mainstream right in the economic policies that they promote. They tend to promote a mixture, of course, a more eclectic cocktail um, of economic policies that includes some protectionist elements, but fundamentally centered around the same neoliberal consensus, that orthodoxy that has dominated for the last 4 decades. And they promote business interests and elite interests just like the mainstream right, but different sections of the business and different sections of the elites. And this is where I think we will get into a bit later in the discussion.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think what's interesting for me at this point, as we're mapping out a picture, is the growth of the far right. I mean, it's a huge question. I've got a whole series on it, and we can't cover everything in one discussion. But what we're saying here is, after the collapse of Stalinism, there was no alternative when things went shit, because they were always going to go shit, because capitalism wasn't an alternative to the problems that the people in that part of the world were facing. There was no left. And therefore the new right, the populist right, the authoritarian right, had legitimacy, grew, took power, and there we are. We have that sitting there now, as that part of Europe. But what you did mention, which I think is interesting, and maybe this connects to the rest of the connection of the development of the far right, is you mentioned neoliberalism, and those methods of capitalism. Now, obviously, the collapse of Stalinism had an effect also in Western Europe, but not in the same way. So we had a stepping back of the workers' movement, for sure, over a period of the 90s, although there were struggles and important struggles, and we are in a process now of rebuilding of those things. But we didn't have at the beginning, or did we, the same far right growth in that period? How would you reflect what was going on in Eastern Europe, and how that grew with the far right getting government power, to what's happening now in the western part of Europe, or south and north, and however you want to pose it?
Yeah, I mean, the far right in Western Europe was relatively marginal. You had a couple of success stories in Austria, now the Freedom Party, um, um, and the National Front in France already in the 80s was making
And you had
important
Thatcher.
electoral. Absolutely, yes, and yeah, and Thatcher actually. Talking about populism, now Thatcher was accurately described, I think, as authoritarian populist by Stuart Hall back in the early 80s, um, which I think is something will be interesting to get back to when maybe we talk about the terminological question. But uh, I think what served as a historical shock for Eastern Europe in terms of creating the fertile ground for the far right. In the case of Western Europe, it was probably, of course, at a smaller scale, It was the crisis of 2007, 2008, 2009 in terms of the Eurozone crisis. That's when it started. And even more so, the austerity policies that started afterwards as a solution used by national and European establishments to manage that crisis. And I think that created the conditions for the current success of the far right that we see today in countries as diverse as Italy, Germany, Netherlands, Sweden, Finland, Switzerland, Portugal recently. So all across Western Europe, different political cultures, different political systems, different economic systems, different models of growth in all these countries, and yet we have this common trend over the past few years of the rise of the far right. They are already in government in Italy. They are part of the government coalition in Sweden, in Finland. They are in talks of joining the government in Netherlands now, where they won the elections last year. Although, according to latest reports, they might not be allowed by the rest of the parties to join the government, but still they won the elections. So this is significant. In Germany, the AfD, Alternative for Germany party, they are second in the polls. In Portugal, you saw in the last elections a couple of weeks ago, the Chega party got 18%. This is a party that got 1% only 5 years ago, in 2019. And now they get 18%, and they are the third political force of the country. So what happened, I think, particularly in these Southern European countries, where initially, as you know very well, because you were in Catalonia at the time when the crisis started, the main benefactor of people's revolt against the establishment and against austerity was the left.
Mm.
You saw the rise of parties like Podemos in the Spanish state, more regional parties like CUP in Catalonia, like Bildu in the Basque Country, and I would say these parties are still doing relatively well compared to the rest of the left in Europe. In Portugal, you had the left bloc. In Greece, you had the famous case of Syriza. These parties on the left that were to the left of mainstream social democratic parties that actually were the first to implement austerity. It was these insurgent parties from the left that managed to capture the people's disillusionment and anger against the establishment. But over the last decade, these parties unfortunately didn't prove themselves to be the alternatives to the status quo as people hoped they would be. In the catastrophic case of Syriza, they ended up running the country and implementing pretty much the same kind of neoliberal policies that they were opposed to. In Portugal, it was a different situation, but still, this alternative left backed the center-left government for a number of years. So again, in people's consciousness, they were assimilated to the status quo. In Spain, Spanish state, Podemos was part of the government coalition up until recently. So this created a space for the far right to present itself as the real alternative to the status quo. To say, look, the left, they are just like the others, they are part of the establishment, we are the real anti-elite alternative. And it's working for them so far, although we know very well that they don't have real solutions to the problems that people are facing. Whereas in other countries, I think you have a different dynamics. So, for example, in countries like Germany, in countries like Netherlands, it's been a more recent deterioration in material conditions that has led to this surge in support for the far right. There's for example, a recent study that shows a strong correlation between the energy crisis in Germany and the impact of the energy crisis on the wider economy, particularly on industry, and the rise of support for AfD. It's a very strong correlation between the two.
Okay.
And it's very recent phenomenon, which links to
This
the war in
is
Ukraine and all the rest.
This is really interesting. But just to backtrack a little bit, just to give a, because I'm interested in mapping this out. Okay, so we're jumping about a bit, but we're setting out a map here. And so you talked about things really changing around the crisis, the economic crisis, the banking crisis, as it was called, or in Spain it's called the brick crisis, actually. But we won't go into that. That was 2007, 2008, the economic crash of the banks and the bailing out of the banks. And then what followed that was a huge austerity measures from most countries in how they were going to solve the problems of the crisis of capitalism at that point. As you rightly said, and then there was a wave of struggles that grew from that, where the Indignada movement in Spain, because we're talking about that specifically because we're both quite aware of it, but in other places as too, Greece, there was a million general strikes, all these things, and this didn't happen in every country, mind you. So I think we've got to paint a fair picture, but that was the first potential of the left picking up the anger of people. The system's not working, okay, which is something that the far right at this minute will claim that mantra. The system's not working, let's change it. So there was that. So we get to that point, and then you start to develop now, different countries. You talk about the different tempos of events, and you talk about in Germany the energy crisis, the energy question, and how this is linked to the growth of the far right. So what I'm kind of interested is this point where when did the right start to become the people who were in opposition? Because if we're talking, I mean, I think we have to be balanced about it. There is still strikes and struggles going on. The left is in a slight disarray in many places. I don't necessarily want to go too depth into that. We want to unravel the far right today. But how did they start to get over a message and take that ground from the left? How do you think that happened?
Yeah, so that's why I think maybe this is a good opportunity to talk a bit about how we talk about these parties, how we define them, how we
Okay.
classify them, how we label them. And a lot of the commentariat now, both in academia, in academic literature, and in the mainstream media, calls this right populist right. Why? Because they tend to center their discourse around this dichotomy, this opposition between a pure people and a corrupt elite. And they present themselves as the representatives, indeed the saviors of the pure people against this corrupt elite. This is what Trump has done as well in the United States, Bolsonaro in Brazil. So it's a global political trend. And they managed to tap into something there, into a certain, like we mentioned, dissatisfaction with the establishment, with the mainstream elites, and so on and so forth. Which is obviously, as socialists, we recognize this dissatisfaction as perfectly legitimate, and we welcome this dissatisfaction. At the same time, we have to, on the one hand, we have to be clear about the main social basis of these parties, which is often simplistically equivalated with the so-called the left behind. Now, those social groups that have been left behind by neoliberal globalization,
The
the
marginalized
losers,
people, those kind of
exactly.
ones.
Exactly. The losers of globalization. You had winners and losers, and the blue collar communities, the working class, have been left behind by globalization because of deindustrialization and privatization and all these processes, and they are now the social base of this populist slash far right. The picture is more complex than that, and actually, um, the size of the working class electorate that votes for these parties is usually overstated. And I don't think it's a mere coincidence why it's overstated by centrist liberal analysts and commentators. To be honest, the main social basis, of course, there are working class people voting for them, but the main social basis comes from the petty bourgeoisie, comes
Okay.
from
Petty bourgeoisie, you mean middle classes, yeah?
I mean, in particular, the owning middle classes, those who own small businesses,
Okay.
those who own their means of production and don't have to sell their labor to survive. And the crisis, when it came, yes, it affected working class people more than any other class in society, and the housing crisis and the austerity, the cost to public services to benefits, disproportionately affected the working class. But it also affected a huge chunk of this layer of the middle class. The small, medium enterprises, now the family business type of people. In Greece, I think I saw a stat that 40% of small, medium businesses closed down in the first 2 years of the crisis. So this was a huge impact. And this, as we know historically, this social class or this fraction of the middle class has been kind of split between the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class, and the working class. In certain situations, when the working class was strong and confident and well organized and credible in putting forward an alternative, it was able to attract significant portions of this proletarianized middle class. But when the left is not that, is not doing that, and is weak and is not credible, and it's seen as part of the establishment, these layers of the middle class, these small business owners, they tend to radicalize in a right-wing direction because of their own material conditions. Their condition is inherently individualist. They are
So
not a
just,
collectivist social
yeah,
class.
this
They
is
are,
interesting. Just to sort of interrupt you on this part. So I spoke to other people and will be in the podcast, and how the populist right, the far right, I think it is important that we get the definitions correct. But in COVID, these people were particularly like bar owners here.
mm,
Often you'll find that the Vox people were
yeah,
bar owners.
yeah,
It's a mixed bag. Yeah, not to say bar owners are all right wing. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is people who owned their own businesses, who were particularly crushed and not helped, were susceptible. And then the far right, how they use a lot of conspiracy theory stuff and anti-government stuff and this kind of thing. So this would match with this analysis that you're talking about. The
yeah.
basis of the new populist far right, if that's a good expression, come from a large proportion of them come from here. Yes, dissatisfied people of a working class character in general. That's obvious, but you're honing in that this is the bulk of their support. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, exactly, absolutely. And I think Vox is a very good example. I would also mention, let's say, Fratelli d'Italia, the current governing party in Italy, Brothers of Italy, whose main constituency, social constituency, are these small, medium enterprise people. They were also the main social base of the Northern League, the La Lega, which was a few years ago the main populist slash far right party in Italy. Now they've been outflanked by Brothers of Italy. In Germany as well, AfD. It is attracting a lot of vote from the former Eastern Germany, from working class layers there, but it's also attracting a lot of the vote from small again these layers of middle class in the west of Germany. So even here, if you look at when UKIP was at its peak in the European elections of 2014 and 2019, the last two European elections where British parties stood candidates in, again, most of its vote tended to come from these layers in society.
Interesting, interesting. So, and we were talking here about the characters like Nigel Farage and these kind of people who represent, well, he tries to represent the ordinary, the ordinary guy, which obviously he's not. The guy has a pint. That's obviously a load of bullshit. I mean, he might like a pint, but that's not who he is. He's not he's not your guy down the local. But you're talking about the likes of him, and those kind of characters, and how they come from a layer in society. I think he probably comes from a more ruling class layer, though. No, I mean, I don't know Nigel Farage particularly. It's enough just to see his ugly face, but to actually find out more about him. But yeah, sorry. So I'm sort of twisting it here.
Absolutely. That's crucial, that point that you've made. We need to make this distinction between the voters of these parties, which the vast majority of the scientific literature, the academic literature, at least in political science, my field,
Yeah.
is focused on who are the voters of these parties, which is, of course, extremely important to know and to map and to understand why these social groups vote for these parties. But this doesn't mean that the party elites, the people leading these parties, let the so-called political entrepreneurs of these parties, and the people backing these parties financially, the very rich donors that these parties tend to enjoy, are coming from the same social class. And you mentioned the Farage. And if we look at the party leaderships in all of these countries, but also the donors of these parties, and by the way, the amount of money that these parties are able to receive in donations from billionaires, for example, AFD was caught up in a scandal a few years ago for receiving undisclosed donations from a billionaire property tycoon who has died in the meantime, but still he donated large sums of money to the AFD. In the UK, both the right-wing populist current inside the Conservative Party and outside the so-called Reform UK Party is backed very generously by millions of pounds in donations from people in the finance industry, hedge fund managers. And this is another reason why this right has managed to rise to prominence. They have the money to do so. They
Okay,
have the
I'm
money.
going to stop you just at that point for this reason.
Yeah.
We're charting out the class content, if you like, of the votes and who runs these parties, and we're obviously coming to the conclusion, without too much detail, that they represent the ruling class, a section of the ruling class. I'll
Yeah.
tell you what we're going to do though, Vlad. We're just going to have a little pause, a little break for people to go and put the kettle on, because this is not a light discussion. So let's just have a little pause. People make yourself a cup of tea, have a sandwich and a biscuit, and then when we come back, let's talk a little bit about the ruling class and maybe, are they backing these parties or are they not? What's going on there? Because we can talk about what's going on in the working class a lot, and we'll do that. And we've mentioned the middle class, but let's have a pause, have a cup of tea, and we'll come back in a minute and we'll pick up on that question, okay?
Sounds great.
I hope you are comfortable. I would like to take the opportunity in this short pause to not give you an advert, message, or bullshit you in any way. We simply ask that you research and think for yourself. If you wish, this thought can be gift-wrapped for you. Please ask any of my assistants, and they will be pleased to help. Please enjoy the second part of the interview. Okay, so welcome back. Hope everybody's got a cup of tea. I actually definitely do have a cup of tea. I don't see that Vlad's got one, but oh yes, he has, the Shakavara mug, in fact, whereas mine is a nasty plastic thing, but I'm not bothered what I drink out of. Anyway, that aside, welcome back to everybody. So where were we? We were talking about the capitalist class and the people who are behind these far right parties. Do you want to start there, about the forces that are behind these parties, and maybe give some examples of who these people are that are leading these parties?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely crucial, I think, and not in being investigated enough by either journalists or academics who deal with this party family. Which we mentioned the donors earlier. But the party elites themselves, I think they represent an interesting trend. They tend to come disproportionately from business, from big business in some cases. And this is an interesting trend on a general note. We know as Marxists that traditionally or commonly, the capitalists like to delegate political power to others, to parties or politicians that they can exert control over.
So
And
just to hold you there, just to paint a picture for the listeners and maybe not sort of, we're talking here that the capitalist class is something that exists. They own the means of production. They own factories. They own media outlets. They're the owners of things.
yes,
And
yes,
what you said there was an important point, that normally they would like to, I'm trying to think of the right phrase. They'd like to get another layer of people, politicians,
yes,
to actually do the dirty work in their name.
yes,
Okay.
yes, exactly, exactly. Like Marx famously said, no, the state is um, the I forgot it. Is the executive board to manage the affairs of the bourgeoisie or something like that? Yes,
Yes.
that's basically the crux of the argument. And of course, there's a huge debate among Marxists going back decades, that some argue that okay, this control is not as strict and direct as we might believe. It's more structural. The state has a certain relative autonomy from the capitalist class, and so on and so forth. Others say no, it's more instrumentalist, where in the sense that the state is the instrument of the capitalist class, and when the state doesn't follow the line, then you have military dictatorships, coups, or even fascism. And I guess we'll get back to the question of fascism towards the end. But the point is that usually capitalists don't rule themselves. They have others ruling on their behalf. But this rise of the far/populist right is a break from that, in the sense that we have capitalists themselves entering politics and trying to assume political power in their own hands. And why is that happening? And I think it's happening because they don't trust anymore. On the one hand, they don't trust the usual representatives of the capitalist class to do their job, right? But mostly, I think it's because there is an intra-class conflict and rivalry between different fractions of the capitalist class. And we have this insurgent fraction of the capitalist class that feels maybe unrepresented by the mainstream parties, which represent the dominant fractions of the capitalist class, which, to put it very broadly and simplistically, over the last 3-4 decades of neoliberal globalization, it tended to be this kind of financial fraction of the capitalist class, finance capital, embedded in transnational supply chains and networks and the international banking system, favoring all these classic neoliberal policies now of free trade and deregulation and privatization and so on. And of course, this advantaged certain fractions of the capitalist class more than others. So finance capital has benefited from this more than industrial capital. Big business has benefited more from this than small and medium capital. Of course, core countries benefit, capitalist classes in core countries like Germany, for example, benefited more from this neoliberal globalization than capitalist classes in peripheral countries or semi-peripheral countries like Greece, for example, to give the classic examples here. So we have a series of internal contradictions and cleavages within the capitalist class in each country and among capitalist classes at an international level that is being also reflected in party politics. And I would argue that the rise of this far-right party family is a reflection of this let's say, rebellious fraction of the capitalist class that wants a different type of growth model, a different type of
I
state.
think this is important. I think this is important because we will, in future episodes and maybe a little bit later, get into the problems that we've got on the left. But the first thing to analyse is the crisis that's happening now in capitalism. And we're not obviously going through that in detail today. We're talking particularly about the far right and how that's reflected. But if the ruling class themselves are very split, this shows this is a very significant reflection of the crisis of the system in total. No,
Yes.
Because I mean, I'm sure the capitalist class have not always been 100% united, but it's easier for them to unite in a whole number of reasons than it is for us. Firstly, they're in charge and they want to stay in charge, and you tend to stick together when you're in charge. It's like being at the top of the table in the football. The arguments are less, and it's but what we're saying here is that there's rumblings at the top of society about different ways to go forth, because this is surely to do with a wider crisis of capitalism, not just on environmental and economic questions, but on social questions, on all sorts of things. And you're saying that these new parties are a reflection of that crisis, no? And
Absolutely.
you talked about the capitalists themselves stepping into the arena, saying we've got to do something, and then coming up with more right wing, more authoritarianism. I presume some of them have gone softer as well, or have they not? Have they just stayed where they were? Have we just seen a growth on the far right of capitalism, or is there still a moderate sort of what's this word? There was this word of sort of caring capitalism. Where's that gone? That was very popular about 5 minutes ago, wasn't it? Caring capitalism. I think this was the discourse of some of the left that we talked about that fucked things up. The Podemoses, the Syrizas. There was this idea that caring capitalism was the thing that even existed. So that doesn't even seem to exist anymore. There isn't that whole space is gone. So is that what you're saying?
Some really good important points you touched upon there, and one is just a parenthesis that I would say neoliberalism is far right already. And I think there is a double standard in how we define and operationalize far left versus far right.
Okay, get into that a bit.
When it comes to the far left, if a party puts forward anti-capitalist policies, so economic policies of an anti-capitalist character or socialist character, they are classed as far left, and rightly so. Although far left is not my favorite term, I would rather use radical left, in the sense of, you are radical in the sense that you want to change society from its roots. You want a systemic change, not just a reform of the system. But when it comes to the far right, if they put forward economic policies from the right end of the spectrum, they are considered center right. They are normalized. They are legitimized. If you put forward policies like the ones advocated by Thatcher and Reagan, now the absolute champions of neoliberalism, with privatization, deregulation, austerity, and so on, you are classed usually in mainstream political science and theory, at least, as center right. Why? Why is that this double standard? Why doesn't neoliberal economic policy place you, which is from the end of the political spectrum in terms of economic policy? It's not from the center. It's from the far right.
It's not a mixed economy or anything like that.
Exactly.
It's not the Swedish model. I think this
exactly.
is
It's not your traditional Christian democracy, right? That dominated Germany and Italy after the Second World War. They were center right, yes. But when you have neoliberalism that advocates this radical retreat of the state, this radical dominance of the market forces over everything else, over the state and over the working class and so on. Although we know that over the state it's not the case, because the state colludes with these market forces, because it's a capitalist state. But there is this double standard that it doesn't have to be racist. The right doesn't have to be racist in order to be far right. It's enough to be neoliberal. And this is a
That's
point
interesting, because I think if you pose it like that, it's really interesting, because what we should therefore say is the PSOE in Spain and the Labour Party in Britain and other parties of social democratic historical content are actually centre-right parties.
I would say so. Yes, I would definitely say in
with a
case of
former history, but more
yeah,
or less that's where they are on the spectrum.
in the sense of Starmer's Labour Party, at least, I think we can confidently place it on the center right, at least.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've seen
But
Rachel
it makes
Reeves.
me think that this would be a better way to understand this scale. That
Yeah,
actually center left is actually quite radical people in many ways, but they're not challenging the capitalist system. You know,
yeah,
there's many people who call themselves anti-capitalists who are actually on the center left. You know,
yeah,
or people who want caring capitalism, they mingle there. You know, so yeah, what we're doing is we're shifting that over to where it should be,
yeah,
that scale, because what you're saying is
absolutely. Because if we
okay.
don't do that, then we simply reflect back and reinforce the way the neoliberal ideology wants us to define these categories.
Okay, and I think this is important, because I think we have to recognise that we've had 40 years of neoliberalist
Yeah,
backlash.
yeah,
We could chart history a bit more than that on another show, but let's say that that's the case, because it is the case. And we're not at the end of that, but we're in a new cycle of that, and the capitalist class is split. But I want to stick a little bit on this naming, you know, the positioning of where people are on this scale, left and right, because I think what's important, you've mentioned a couple of times in the interview so far, I've used the word far left in a very broad, throw it out kind of way. You know, I know what that means to me, and I think that means something to most people, but not necessarily. You know, some people ignore those terms and just hear what they want to hear, or, you know, what responds to their anger or whatever. But if we look at this split, if you say, of those who have got capitalist best interest at heart, you know, so those that are all happy to go along with neoliberalism while it's working fine, you know, and when everything starts to go to shit, which it is in many, many places in the world before all this, but now in the West and in the rich countries, everything's going to shit as well. Capitalism's got a massive crisis with the environment, a whole load of questions. We're in a very sticky situation. We've got wars, you know, in Ukraine, in Israel, Israel, Palestine. So things are pretty heavy. Yeah.
yeah,
And then we've got this rise, which is what we're fundamentally talking about here. We've got this rise of a new far right that's existed a little while now. I think it's to say the populist right is a new phenomenon is not true. It's been around for a little while now. But I want maybe you to touch on a bit more on the characterization of this popular right, far right, and more importantly, the historical meaning of what fascism is. Because it's very easy right now to go, we're spinning towards fascist hell or authoritarian, and in some elements we are, you know,
yeah,
and there's a lot there. But I just, because we've got stuck on this terminology point, I think it's worth us hammering this out a little bit more. So could you
yeah.
expand on that?
Absolutely, and I think it's more than a scholastic debate. What terms we use. I think it helps us clarify the understanding of these forces and the developments they reflect and how to tackle them. And I would start from the point you made earlier that this is all this that we are talking about is embedded in a structural crisis of capitalism, which is manifested in all those ways that you listed. And yes, usually the capitalist class is united when it comes to class struggle. They are united against us. But with each other, they are not united because competition is still a feature of capitalism. They compete with each other now for resources, for markets, for profits, for state policies that favor their interests. That's why Marx called them hostile brothers in his characteristically
Hostile
insightful.
brothers.
Yes,
Okay, yeah.
capitalists are hostile brothers. And I love that expression. It should be the
Well, they
title
love
of a
each
book.
other, but they're always fighting.
Exactly. And this is part of the schizophrenic condition of the capitalist class. Um, they have to act together against the other social classes, but they are still fighting each other. They have fundamentally incompatible interests. And I think that this is reflected in the kind of fractions of the capitalist class that are backing and these populist right-wing parties and benefiting from them when they get into government. So just a couple of examples to make the discussion a bit more concrete. In Italy, it seems to me pretty clearly that it's the national big business, the domestic fraction of the capitalist class in Italy that is trying to fight back against the domination of transnational capital over Italy. And if we look at one of the co-founders, he's not just a member, he's a co-founder of the party currently in government, Brothers of Italy, Guido Crosetto. He's also Minister of Defense as we speak. He's a former lobbyist for the domestic arms industry. So he comes from that section of the capitalist class. So what I'm trying to say is that the fraction of the capitalist class represented by each of these parties may differ from country to country. In the case of Hungary, it's a bit more complex because Orban's regime, on the one hand, again, is defending the interests of the domestic big capitalist class, the Hungarian bourgeoisie, and which has reaped huge benefits during his regime, especially in energy sector, construction sector, even the banking sector, which explains some of his non-neoliberal measures, some certain protectionist measures that he's taken. But at the same time, because of the relative weakness and peripherality of the Hungarian economy, he also had to make big concessions to multinational companies. And the German car manufacturers in particular are some of his biggest supporters. They benefited immensely from his neoliberal policies in government. So the picture can be a bit more complex from country to country. In the UK, it's a different picture. Here, it's not necessarily the national bourgeoisie or let's say those sections of industrial capital that is boosting the far right slash populist right current. It's actually it's finance capital, hedge funds and private equity sections of finance capital in particular that are funding these parties. If you look at the politicians themselves, the leader of Reform Party, Richard Tice, he's a multimillionaire who made a property developer, private equity kind of guy who is leading this right-wing populist party. In the Tory party, you have someone like Jacob Rees-Mogg, one of the main, let's say, entrepreneurs of the right-wing populist current inside the Conservative Party. He comes from the hedge fund industry. Some of the people who are not directly involved but are backing financially these parties, like Paul Marshall, another guy coming from the finance sections of capitalist class. He is the owner of GB News, which brings me back to the point about why these parties are successful. They are also successful because they have the money to buy and own media, mainstream media that disseminates their messages.
So this brings me to another question, which we're sort of edging towards, I think, as well, because we're trying to give a bit of history background in this discussion and bring it up to contemporary.
Yeah.
And we're talking about popularist right, far right terminology being important so that we can understand. That's the reason for this series of the podcast. Obviously, we're going to mix in arts and other questions, but in this particular discussion, we're trying to map it out here a little bit, trying to get a bit of a foot on the situation so that we can do something about it. But some of the stuff that they're coming out with, even within the Tory party, the whole debate, we talked about where things are left, right, centre on the scale, but things have been shifted far to the right within both sides, both wings of the capitalist state. And some of the stuff that's coming out, and particularly we jump over the Atlantic and listen to Trump right at this minute, this is dangerous fascist speak. And maybe you could give us a little bit of clarification, because fascism is an old word that I think is come from Italy, from Mussolini's party. I remember learning it at school, believe it or not. Fascism was, I think it was a tied up group of
Yeah.
wheat or something. Anyway, the
Yeah.
fascist ideology
Sticks.
is specifically something. Now, these groups, these organizations, reform and these kind of things, and the populist right that are leading these countries, can we say they're fascist? Is that lazy to say that? Or is fascism something that they could become? Is it linked to authoritarianism and capitalism? Where would you sort of, how would you not terminalize in Finnish, terminologicalize? I'm using a word a bit like yours. What was yours? Proliferality or something. You said it was wonderful. Anyway, I'm rambling.
Yeah, I just invented the word. Basically.
Yeah, I love inventing words. I know some people hate that shit, but I love it. But what I'm trying to get at here is this populist right turning quicker and easier into a full-on fascist threat? And if it is, then that means our game really has to up. So what do you think? Any comment on that?
Yeah, totally. I would say, on the one hand, that we shouldn't call them populist, like I've indicated already, and why? Because populism is maybe one of their characteristics, but it's not their defining characteristic. It is not what they are about. It may be their discourse being centered around this opposition between the people and the elites. Okay, but I wouldn't say that even when we look just at their discourse, I wouldn't say necessarily that populism is their key feature. Nativism, ethno-nationalism, I think, are more prominent, maybe in some cases, than populism. But we fundamentally have to look at what they are doing when they get into parliament, or even more so when they get into government.
Just to stop you, I know you're in flow, but explain populism in a sentence or two, just so.
So populism, there's huge debate around whether it's an ideology or it's just a strategy, a rhetorical style. I don't think it's an ideology. I think it's a rhetorical strategy.
So it's kind of say anything to anybody to get votes.
Yeah, but it has to be centered around this opposition between the people and the elites, with you being the representative of the people. This is what makes you populist.
Okay.
And
so
this
carry on,
certain,
because that's good.
yes, but these parties certainly do that, but it's not their defining feature. And most importantly, it's not because they are not on the side of the people. As I tried to illustrate earlier, they come from very elite backgrounds and they promote very elite interests, the interests of certain fractions of the capitalist class. And we can see that, for example, with the current government in Italy that cut welfare benefits last year, or the kind of economic agenda that the conservatives have implemented in government, or this Reform UK party wants to implement, or even Vox in the Spanish state. They've voted against every single economic policy that was aimed at alleviating the conditions for the living conditions for the popular classes in the Spanish state. So there's nothing popular about these parties in terms of the policies they put forward and the class interests they defend. That's why we shouldn't call them populist, because it gives them a certain aura of representing the people. Even if it's in a demagogic way, it still kind of gives them some credit, and it's not entirely defining of who they are. Secondly, I don't think they are fascist either, because to go back to the more traditional Marxist analysis, and I think you will agree with me that fascism, its historical function was for the dominant fraction of the capitalist class in both Italy and Germany, which are the classical examples of fascism coming into power, no? In the case of Italy, the dominant fraction was the industrial and the financial fractions of capital from the north of the country that were trying to win the competition for hegemony against the land owning fraction of the ruling class concentrating in the south of Italy. And in Germany as well, there was a stalemate between different fractions of the capitalist class, between small and medium capital versus big capital, and so on and so forth. So there was a stalemate, and there was the kind of rivalry and fragmentation within the capitalist class that we can also see today. And this is a similarity, but the fundamental difference was that the bigger stalemate and the more important stalemate was between the capitalist class with all these different fractions on the one hand and the working class on the other. It was a balance of power between the two of them that could not be broken by either side through the framework of bourgeois democracy, through mere elections and the liberal democratic processes as before. It was a stalemate in the class struggle that could only be resolved in favor of the capitalist class, of the dominant fraction of the capitalist class, through fascism, through a dictatorship that would break completely the power and the strength of the working class, particularly the trade unions and the communist and social democratic parties that represented this class, which, of course, this class had the upper hand, had the upper hand in the previous period, didn't manage for the reasons that maybe we can go into another time, the several revolutionary situations where the working class could have taken power and overthrow capitalism. It failed to do so. It was not a revolutionary situation anymore when fascism came into power in Italy and Germany, but the working class was still, even though it was on retreat, it was still very strong, very powerful. And it could not be defeated completely through the means of liberal democracy, which meant that the ruling class had to discard liberal democracy and employ fascism as a way to promote its interests.
Yeah, I think this is really important stuff, and I think so if I could sort of round it up a bit, because we are running a little bit short of time. What we're saying here is that some of the splits in the ruling class have similar reflections to the period where fascism took power. But what we don't have, we did have Podemos and Syriza and a few little ripples of the left coming back to life, but we didn't have them taking power. We could have had, but it didn't. But we do have the disappointment of them not making big changes, and this has allowed a space to open up where this new right, this populist, this far right, I think far right good enough for now, has taken some of this vacuum in the present stage. So we can the stage we're at is that there is a division within the capitalist class. There is a growth, and these people are putting on very far right wing agendas. They're using all sorts of tactics, modern media, in very similar to media and fashion. The growth of Hitler is a particularly interesting subject, particularly from an artist's point of view. We won't go there today. But how to use mass media, how they used all these things, how conspiracy theories come into all that. They're gaining a footing and a vote, and a mass vote in some ways. And what we're missing, thankfully or not thankfully, is that we haven't had the working class pose power, and therefore what we're saying here is that they haven't had to go the full hog, and we wouldn't at this stage label it as fascism, but it's a step very close towards it. And I think people use the word fascist very liberally. We're using it more scientifically today, maybe we could discuss if that's a good or bad thing, but I think what we're trying to do today is get down deep into it a little bit. And so we should define it as that these groups at this stage are not fascist, but the emphasis I want to put is at this stage, because this is the laying of a foundation, because they are worried that we'll get our shit together. What I want to do though, Vlad, is I want to finish it at that point, because I think the next discussion we should have is let's get our shit together then. In terms of the left and in terms of the response to this vacuum and the feeling. I've got one more question for you, but before I ask you that, do you have anything you want to round up our discussion on?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. We need to have a separate discussion on how to get our shit together. But as a final reflection, there is a term that I'm sympathetic with, which is authoritarian neoliberalism,
Okay.
which may be used to describe most accurately these developments. It's not a very sexy term. It's even sometimes hard to pronounce for me, but I think it gives an idea of this marriage between far-right economic policies, which is what neoliberalism is, and far-right kind of um, political and social measures to control the population or to curb the right to protest and to freedom of speech and all these things, to unionization and all this, which the Tories are doing at the moment in UK. And maybe a more extreme example of that we see unfolding at the moment in Argentina,
Mm.
uh, on a continent where neoliberalism started, arguably as a
Well, in Chile,
practice.
yeah, yeah.
Yes, exactly. And now we can see this more authoritarian version of neoliberalism being tried out in Argentina.
Wow. So I think we've covered a lot of ground there. And right at the end we start talking about Argentina, and the
Yeah,
whole debate opens up in my head, and then we haven't
exactly.
even gone to the United States. But I think what we have done is we've done a bit of good groundwork here that we can do subsequent podcasts and discussions on. So I thank you for that discussion. What I want to do is just finish on, I'm asking every guest, every person that speaks, because although the series is on the rise of the far right, there's also a side hustle going on in this podcast series, and that's on the question of neurodiversity. Now, I'm getting some people who are big in that to interview and to discuss and whatever. And in the first episode, I talked about why that was important to me. But I'm asking every guest, neurodiversity, what does that mean to you?
With the caveat that I'm almost completely ignorant on this topic, instinctively I would think that it's about acknowledging and maybe welcoming the fact that there is not one way of being um, one right way of thinking and behaving. There's not one rationality that is the right one, and whoever deviates from that rationality, type of rationality, which is of course the rationality of the Western white male prototype of the Enlightenment, no?
Mm.
Uh, the rational person that makes rational choices and decisions, and it's pragmatic and so on and so forth, which this kind of, if you want, simplistic and hegemonic model of rationality has been used to explain and legitimize capitalism. Oh,
Mm.
capitalism is the only way to go because it's a reflection of human nature. Now it's a reflection of reason, of human reason, of how rational people act. Like the the caricature of Adam Smith says, because Adam Smith was a bit more complex than his supporters make him out to be. But the common interpretation of Adam Smith is that no, if we all act based on our rationality, then the market will deliver the outcomes that benefit everybody. The buyer buys, the seller sells, everybody's happy, and this kind of understanding of rationality has been used to legitimize capitalism. And I think that escaping this, going beyond this, and recognizing that there is and there should be maybe a broader range of rationalities, which is how one way is I would understand neurodiversity, is something that could potentially undermine this hegemony of capitalist ideology.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting answer. Actually, I've thought it's interesting the whole the rationalization, Enlightenment period, and where all that comes from. And yeah, it's a good way to put it. I certainly think it's something that can undermine the capitalist reason of thinking that
Mm.
you say. But yeah, good answer, Vlad. Good answer. Okay,
Thank you.
well. thank you very much for coming on the show. We're going to get you back. You'll either be back in the space station part, or we're going to do another interview. We're certainly going to deal with this question of getting our shit together. But a first step of getting our shit together is to understand what we've got to get together. Which I think really helped us map out a bit today. So thank you very much for being on the show, and look forward to also we're going to do at some point, we're going to do a discussion on anti-fascism football and bring in culture in. And people are going to have to wait a little bit for that, but it's coming. So yeah, thanks very much for coming, and we'll talk again soon. Okay.
Thank you, Rob. It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Okay. Bye for now.
Bye.
Hello, this is your captain speaking. Please fasten your seatbelts as we travel to the space station. Some people can find the experience uncomfortable. If you have any disagreements or positive criticism, please leave them in various comment spaces that Outa-space provides.
So, welcome back up to the space station, where we have again Glyn Mathews. Welcome back to the space station, Glyn. That's 2 times on the row.
It is. It's reassuring to know that I didn't mess up so badly on the first one that I've been invited back.
Well, maybe you did, and I invited you back to give you a second chance. Probably. Anyway, welcome back. So you've heard the interview with Vlad. What do you think?
Well, it's always enlightening to hear from Vlad. I think I was one of the first people to read the book he published on the far left, because I read it before it was published. So it was nice to hear what he had to say about the far right, and I think it fit nicely. You know, it was like a nice sequel to the far left in terms of analysis, because he made the point, you know, that it was the failure of the left, some of the decisions they made, particularly in Southern Europe, that was a kind of a direct precursor to the rise of the populist right in those countries as well.
Okay, so you made a quite clear point that in those countries you used the term populist right. We sort of I used the term, I think when I listened back to the interview, I said populist right, far right, and Vlad did a bit of a job in the discussion about trying to characterize things, and that's what we're trying to do, because obviously the whole series is about the rise of the far right and what it means. And analysing it. So, what do you think about the term popular right? Does that resonate with you or would you say far right? How would you use it?
I mean, I think they are interchangeable to a degree, because in most cases they are one and the same thing in terms of not the concepts, but the organizations and movements we're talking about, one and the same thing. But I would disagree with Vlad, or not necessarily disagree, but change the emphasis on it. I think it is important to use the term populist rather than far right, because although in many instances they are far right, I think they are of a populist persuasion, and they have that air of respectability compared to, you know, Vlad mentioned, for example, the Sweden Democrats and how they've grown in recent years, and they certainly have. But one of the things they've done along that time where they've grown is like change their image into respectable politicians, rather than, you know, what they were known as before, as just a party of thugs.
All right, yeah, okay. So you define the difference between them, because I mean Vlad went into it in a big political science kind of way, but you would say that the populist right term works in the fact that they've got nice suits on and they're not nutcases in the first obvious instant. I mean, because back in the day when the far right was very small, you're talking about, they were sort of boneheads or complete people off the scale. But you're saying because they're able to popularize their position in a language of the street or something like that. Is that what you would mean by popular?
Yeah, but I think it's more than just them in suits. I mean, if you look at like the British National Party, for example, in the early 2000s, at that point they were, they had the respectable suits and tried to transform themselves, but they were still seen as those kind of thugs in suits, really. Whereas the likes of the Sweden Democrats now have fundamentally transformed the image into respectable opposition politicians in terms of the rhetoric.
I'm just trying to get this straight in my head. So, in the terminology you're using, is they're popular if they're playing the game a bit more. They're sort of, I mean, not necessarily what they're arguing for, because I think Vlad sort of developed that quite well. That they're very much their agenda is far right. But you're saying that they play the parliamentary system, that they don't necessarily have. I mean, I don't know whether this is true with all the far right groups growing. Whether there's a wing, because often like the BNP had a wing, Combat 18, and it was connected, and they were street thugs and they smashed up left wing things. So they had that traditional fascist ideology behind them. And what we're saying here then is is because with Vlad at the end, we talks about it being different from fascism, that it's a preparation towards it potentially, but it's a different thing.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. It is fundamentally different from that. And to be clear, I'd agree that they are far right, but I think the terminology, it is important. It does explain a different characterization, and I don't think we should avoid using that term. But perhaps it's probably best to use both terms at the same time. Normally you would say that's superfluous, but I think they both hold important meaning.
Right. Okay. I mean, what just jumped into my head is, we're on the far left, and we've got no problem with saying that. And we know the diversity of the far left, and within one country, let alone all the others. So, I suppose these are very generalized terms, which if you looked at one particular force or within that force, different characters, and how they present themselves and the rest. Anything else with that? I mean, is there any other sort of terminology things because there's very much a discussion around terminology and mapping out, because we talked a lot about history. We talked about Eastern Europe, and then we talked about Western Europe. We didn't focus in on one particular country. So this was a broad discussion, which I'm hoping lays the basis for lots of understanding in different places. So
I think that's an important point, that it was talking in the broad terms, and I don't think any one of the different parties or movements that Vlad talked about are the same. If you went into more detail, you'd start seeing as many differences as you did similarities. But one thing that did seem to buck the trend really was Ireland, which goes back to the last time I was on the space station, maybe the last episode.
Podcast when we talked to Paul Murphy.
Because in Ireland in recent years, the left has had several victories. They haven't been in a position of taking power, but you've had the mass non-payment of the water charges. You had the mass campaign of repeal for abortion rights. So all of which were a big step forwards for the left, rather than going on the back foot. But then at the same time, as we discussed on the last space station, you've seen the rise of that kind of far right in Ireland. So that does seem to buck the trend of it being the failure of the left, which is
could you argue
to the right.
I mean, I hear your point, because the narrative that we had in that discussion was, history this, history that. Left had a chance. There was a crisis. Left took the chance in some places, and in others there was nothing going on. But in places like Ireland, there were some social reforms of a left character. I mean, there are social issues. The left wasn't in power in Ireland, is what you're saying, and therefore the growth of the far right there can't be linked to yet the left letting
I think it's a combination of the left not being in power, but the left also being present. There's several TDs that were, not in a position of power, but on the left
so there was a
showing
pole
opposition.
of attraction which was different,
Yeah.
rather than them being in power.
And crucially as well, there were step forwards for the left in Ireland for the campaigns that we mentioned. So it wasn't like a huge defeat, and a setback for the left. So it does seem to buck the trend of Greece or Italy or Spain or Portugal in that sense.
Although what jumps into my head is some of the social backlash on some progressive laws that were passed, in Spain particularly, and obviously in Ireland on abortion, and then the growth of marriage rights and this kind of stuff, and some of the right wing growth has been a backlash to that.
Yeah.
Not necessarily. I mean, I know they've hooked onto that in the same way as they've hooked onto the COVID crisis and the vaccine stuff. They've also hooked onto the, what a proper person should be like, I suppose.
Yeah, that does make sense. So they're hooking onto the same social discontent, but in a different context where it's that discontent exists because of a push forward of the left rather than a defeat of the left.
Interesting. Okay, so any sort of, I mean, there's a lot going on that we laid out there. Is there anything else that you would want to add at this moment on this sort of, let's say, the wider picture of the I suppose it's the characterization of the because he talked about the class content a lot, and the overemphasis on the fact that it's so-called silly white working class people voting for the right-wing agenda. That you've honed in on this fact that they were basically based on a middle-class vote in many ways, and he also talked about sort of the capitalists not having representatives as such, but themselves putting their hat in the ring. Is that what do you think to that? Any comment?
Yeah, that I found interesting. First of all, it's not what I expected in terms of the voter base, if I'm honest. But I think it does link with that, change of course to the respectability of it. That would change the voter base of it. But what I had noticed, and it's good to probably further that analysis. Not something I would do because I'm certainly not qualified to do, but of the social basis of the leaders of the party, because I think the first sign of that probably was someone like Nigel Farage, who was a hedge fund banker, further from the ordinary man than you could possibly be, despite his attempts. But that seems to be the generalized trend across all of these groups, is people in that firmly embedded in the capitalist system, carrying out the work themselves rather than.
So this is if we see a wider scale capitalist crisis, which I think everybody who's got any eyes open at the moment can see that society is in a bit of a mess. And from our perspective, we would say a capitalist crisis, not just a crisis. But what we're kind of sketching out here is that this is a conscious move by elements of the ruling class to move things to the right, or they're transforming.
It does seem to be, yeah. It's kind of like, the mentality, or this is going badly, let me do it myself, kind of thing.
Yeah, I experienced that feeling in my life sometimes. Okay, so yeah, that's interesting. Anything else you'd like to add about the interview?
No, really. I suppose it would just be questions that neither of us could answer. I suppose it'd be good to you to interview Vlad on another episode.
If we did this first before we interviewed Vlad, because then what we can do is we can think about those questions and we can bring them to the future podcasts.
Yeah, well, I suppose I would ask to develop on the answer that we both came to about, how does Ireland buck the trend? I suppose I had asked him if he'd agree about the way I would recategorize, the use of the term populist right and far right as both being equally as important.
By the way, just to jump in before you, he also ended on this term authoritarian neoliberalism, which I thought was an interesting term. Any catch on that? So I think it's an interesting term because I think where he's coming from, and obviously he's not here to add, but neoliberalism is the dominant ideology over the last period. It's still strong. Yeah, there's chinks in its armor, but it's still strong. And using the word authoritarian with it means that we're going to carry on with that process that neoliberalism stands for, and maybe we should have a discussion on that, but that would take a little while. But it has a righter wing character than it already had, based on the state forces and this kind of thing. Would you go with that term, or any questions you'd have for that? Because I think it was an interesting.
Yeah, I think I'd want him to elaborate on that a bit more, because I can certainly see elements of that. I mean, certainly the economic side of the populist far right has definitely been neoliberalist wings of it, quite openly neoliberalist in terms of that. But then you also see wings of it which are very anti-lockdown measures, that kind of thing.
Also, it's very nationalist, protectionist element to it, which does buck some globalized.
But I don't think that necessarily counters with neoliberalism, because neoliberalism was also about open borders, but economically, but not our borders, other people's borders anyway.
Okay, yeah. So it's like I discussed with somebody the other day, and they said, "Oh, do you think it'd be all right?" These, somebody from England saying moving to Spain these days because of Brexit. I said, "You got money?" And they said, "Yeah." There would be no problem, because everything could be done. But if you're from a poor country, you're from and you're going to need help, then there's a fortress around it. But if money can still flow and they can still take, so that's the difference you would make. Yeah,
and I think there certainly was definitely a very liberal, non-state interventionist kind of free-thinking capitalism, and that was, I think, something that you mentioned in there, that a lot of the kind of early stages of like the right-wing anti-lockdown came from bar owners who weren't being helped throughout the lockdown. So you can see how it may not have been by design that they went in that direction, but you can certainly see why it went in that direction. So I think, there's definitely value in that term, the neoliberal authoritarianists.
Okay. Well, anything more, or should we wrap it up there? What do you think? I think there's some good comments.
Yes, I think that's a good place to leave it. I've left myself with more questions than answers, but
well,
that's not necessarily a bad thing, yeah?
No, I think that's a good thing, because people are listening to this podcast expecting us to give you all these answers. What we're doing is we're discussing it, and we want to open up this debate, because I don't think it can be, here are the answers to why they are like they are. I think we have to, at each point, we have to go a little bit deeper. We have to question all these things. I mean, we didn't even get to Portugal with Vlad, and I knew that actually he did want to talk about that quite a lot, and what's going to happen in Britain. So there's a lot to play for here. So I think we are in the stage of asking questions, because in my mind, in lots of places the far right is gaining power, but in a lot of other places they're poised to be the opposition, and that hasn't worked in all cases, but certainly, coming from England and Wales with elections this year in Britain, this is going to be an issue. If you're American with Trump, and what that would mean, the characterization of that, I think we've got a little bit of time to ask some questions, and the role of a podcast is to do that. But we do have to come up with some answers, and I think you mentioned Vlad's book, which people can look in the links. There'll be a link to that. He talked about the failures of the left in the last period, and I think I used the term, we need to do a podcast of how we get our shit together. But let's map out the problems before we necessarily start mapping out the solutions, although they do come in hand, I guess.
I think that's a good place to leave it, isn't it? We've started the discussion. I don't think we have to claim to have the answers at the beginning of a discussion.
No. Cool. All right, Glenn. Well, I think you've passed the test again. I think we'll have you back in the space station. Have a good journey back down to Earth, and I shall hopefully see you very soon.
I'll see you soon. I look forward to my return, whenever that might be.
It won't be too long away, I'm sure. Thank you very much. Glenn.
Thanks.
See you later now. Bye-bye.
Bye, Rob.
Thank you for traveling with us today. Please remember on leaving this bubble that you might feel weird. That is completely normal. We recommend taking a few moments to adjust yourself and fix whatever masks you use to survive in this world. If you still feel odd, then we strongly recommend dancing when you are alone. Please also remember to take care of each other. It's very easy to forget,